Well, good evening. Good evening. You are all very welcome here tonight. I'm Bernard Brady, chair of the Theology Department at St. Thomas, and I'm pleased to introduce both our speaker tonight, Massimo Fagioli, and our conference, The Church in the Modern World, Teaching and Understanding Gaudium et Spes After 50 Years. With the support of the College of Arts and Sciences and the Murray Institute of St. Thomas, the Theology Department hosted a conference in September of 2012 celebrating the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Second Vatican Council. That conference included presentations by 30 scholars from 22 institutions, 4 internationally known keynote speakers, and about another 100 participants. We were delighted with the turnout and with the response. So, again, with the support of the College of Arts and Sciences and the Murray Institute, we decided to recognize the anniversary of the closing of the Council with a similar conference, this time focusing on Gaudium et Spes. Our conference has nearly 40 scholars from 22 institutions, 4 internationally known keynote speakers, and again, about 100 other participants. It is, as we say, right and just that we should think about, reflect on, critique, and talk about Gaudium et Spes for the next few days. Theologian John O'Malley described Gaudium et Spes as the most distinctive document produced by the Second Vatican Council, and the one perhaps most revelatory of the Council's meaning. The prominent Dutch theologian Eric Borgman wrote that Gaudium et Spes was the epitome of the Council. Gaudium et Spes continues to have an enormous impact on Catholic theology, particularly moral theology. For example, Joseph Selling wrote, "I suggest that as far as the discipline of moral theology is concerned, the teaching of Gaudium et Spes has become normative in the contemporary church. It is the benchmark for the state of the art." David Hollenbach commented, "Overall, it can be regarded as the most authoritative and significant document in Catholic social teaching issued in the 20th century." Finally, we have St. John Paul II's testimony. "I must confess," he said, "that Gaudium et Spes is particularly dear to me, not only because of the themes it develops, but also because of the direct participation that was allowed to me for its elaboration." Indeed, Gaudium et Spes, section 22, appears more than 200 times in his magisterial teachings, and section 24 is referred or quoted more than 100 times in his magisterial teachings. The document demands our attention, and thus the call of this conference. We begin then with an expert, indeed the expert on Vatican II and its most distinctive document. Dr. Massimo Fagioli came to us, as you will hear for yourself, from Italy. He worked in the John XXIII Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna between 1996 and 2008. He received his PhD from the University of Turin in 2002. In 2008, he crossed the pond to become a visiting fellow at the Jesuit Institute in Boston College for 2 years. Dr. Fagioli is now associate professor in our department, and I'm happy to say that I was the chair who hired him. He also directs our Institute for Catholicism and Citizenship. As his chair, I cannot keep up with his speaking schedule and writing output. Earlier this week, he was in Fordham, in New York, at Fordham University to give a lecture. He writes regularly for Italian and American newspapers and journals on the church, religion, and politics. And indeed, he appears on the pages of this week's Catholic Spirit, our local archdiocesan newspaper. His books and essays have been published in 7 languages. His most recent books are 2 from 2012, Vatican II, The Battle for Meaning, and True Reform. Last year, he also published 2 books, John XXIII, The Medicine of Mercy, and Sorting Out Catholicism, A Brief History of the New Ecclesial Movements. And, if that is not enough, he has a book soon to be published by Paulus Press, Pope Francis, Tradition in Transition. His talk tonight is titled Gaudium et Spes After 50 Years, Its Meaning for a Learning Church. Please welcome Dr. Fagioli to this podium.
Good evening, everybody, and I want to thank you, Dr. Brady or Bernie, not just for hiring me, but also for this introduction. It is really an accomplishment to be here and speak at the institution that really gave me the opportunity after in leaving Europe to do something different. And so I'm very grateful to the department and to the College of Arts and Sciences and to the University of St. Thomas. And I want to give back what I can in trying tonight to say something about the value of Gaudium et Spes for the learning of the church, and particularly also for the institutions of higher learning in the Catholic Church. So the title of my lecture is Gaudium et Spes 50 Years After, Its Meaning for a Learning Church. Anniversaries are supposed to let us remember something important. But anniversaries are not always about renewing old commitments. When anniversaries are official anniversaries, they are part of the creation of an institutional memory that necessarily entails some forgetting too. We are now approaching, in 2015, the end of the 50th anniversary of the Second Vatican Council, 2012-2015, and now this 4-year-long anniversary has taken a shape already. In this sense, the anniversary of Vatican II is different from the celebration of an institutional memory. If it is true that many theologians and lay Catholics have celebrated unapologetically and explicitly the 50 years from the conciliar event, the institutional church as such has given few direct signs of the will to remember Vatican II. And even the election of Pope Francis has not changed that. Some in the church still hold the legacy of Vatican II as captive of the battle over its interpretations, a battle that here in America especially is frequently a subset of the ideology of the culture wars. And Pope Francis has not changed that. Now, let me be clear. I'm very convinced that Pope Francis is a Vatican II Pope in a way like his predecessors Paul VI, John Paul II, and Pope Benedict. But in the history of the papacy in these last 50 years, Jorge Mario Bergoglio is truly the first pope of a post-Vatican II church, a church that has not forgotten Vatican II, and it's not captive of a particular idiosyncratic interpretation of the event and of its teaching. Biographically, Jorge Mario Bergoglio is the first pope who was ordained priest after Vatican II in 1969. But his election has not changed the course of the institutional church set by Pope Benedict before 2012, which means initially Vatican II was not going to be celebrated under a different banner, that is the new evangelization, and perhaps that in order to avoid a new controversy over the meaning of the Second Vatican Council. So, with the election of Pope Francis, has nothing about the role of Vatican II changed in the Catholic Church? Not quite. Many of the changes we have seen since March the 13th, 2013, the anniversary will be tomorrow, are related, I think, especially to the role of Gaudium et Spes, of the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. It is now clear to me that the pontificate of Pope Francis has brought about one of the most surprising reversal of fortunes regarding the theological legacy of an ecumenical council, and that is especially true for the destiny of the pastoral constitution Gaudium et Spes. Gaudium et Spes was a document that became almost forgotten during the pontificate of Pope Benedict XVI for many reasons. But Gaudium et Spes is one of the council documents most often quoted by Pope Francis. And there's little doubt that the pastoral constitution is the key document of Vatican II to guide our understanding of Pope Francis and his relationship with both the Council itself and the post-Council period. The renaissance of Gaudium et Spes is visible especially in the two most important acts of Pope Francis, teachings of Pope Francis, in the very title of the exhortation Evangelii Gaudium of November 2013, and especially relevant for this year, 2015, in the text of the documents for the two synods on the family that are celebrated the first one, October 2014, and the next one, next October. So what is the meaning of this reversal, of this comeback of the pastoral constitution of Vatican II? What is the meaning of Gaudium et Spes for the Church in the modern world of today, in a world that is significantly different from the world of 1965? The legacy of Gaudium et Spes is particularly tied to the legacy of Vatican II as a whole, and vice versa. And there is an historical and theological case to be made for that. From an historical standpoint, the message of Gaudium et Spes about the Church in the modern world can be seen as the alpha and omega of the Second Vatican Council, since the theology of one of the theological fathers of Vatican II, French Dominican Marie-Dominique Chenu, is at the beginning and at the end of the Second Vatican Council. It's in the first public message of the Council, published on October the 20th, 1962, the Message to the World, the first document approved and published by the Council. And Chenu and this idea of the Church in the modern world is incredibly visible in Gaudium et Spes, the last document approved by the Council on December the 7th, 1965. But there is also a particular theological relationship between Gaudium et Spes and Vatican II from the standpoint of the reception of the Council. In some churches, in some local churches, some dioceses, the immediate and unconscious connection made between Vatican II and the 60s, used as a pejorative, has mistreated Gaudium et Spes and everything the pastoral constitution stands for, the Church in the modern world, and everything that is part of this relationship is sometimes cast as the beginning of the end for pure, real Catholic tradition. In retrospect, those journalists who in 1965 summed up Gaudium et Spes in the famous headline, "The Pill and the Bomb," had no idea of the damages that they were doing to the document itself. The devastating effects of the atomic bomb were figuratively experienced by the cultural and moral landscape of the pastoral constitution, the first victim of the post-Vatican II sometimes monothematic and legalistic debate, among other things, about marriage, family, and reproduction. The cultural turn interpreted by Vatican II, and I want to be clear, the cultural turn interpreted by Vatican II, not produced by Vatican II, was largely overshadowed in the impression of many in the public opinion, but sadly also in the culture of some leaders in the Church, by the idea that Catholic theology in Gaudium et Spes had become kind of an accomplice in the destruction of the old moral system, and that Gaudium et Spes was the manifesto of that, almost like the civil constitution of the clergy in the France of the Revolution in 1791. The Constitution of 1791 in revolutionary France subordinated the Roman Catholic Church in France to the French government, and in a similar way for some, the pastoral constitution Gaudium et Spes of 1965 subordinated Catholic theology to the relativistic, materialistic, atheistic, and pantheistic culture of the 60s. In a way, for some, Gaudium et Spes was the ultimate inside job against the Catholic tradition. Now, it's clear that Gaudium Spes is the most perfect case, sadly, of a problem in the reception of a document of the Second Vatican Council, a reception divided along theological fault lines, overlapped with the theological political rejection of Vatican II in general, and especially of the document that opens Catholic theology to a truly global church, as Gaudium Spes does. I have to say, as a European who migrated to America a few years ago, it's my impression that this problem is particularly evident in the American Catholic Church. And it's clear to me that the problematic reception of Gaudium Spes in America is part, and we will see that in the next 6 months, is part of the problematic relationship between the American Catholic Church, in some quarters especially, and Pope Francis. This is why it will be necessary at some point to write a history of the reception of Vatican II in America, and especially of Gaudium et Spes, and of its role in the culture of Catholic higher education in America. So the issue here is theological, it's socio-political, but is first of all what is relevant for us. It's also a cultural issue. As a Catholic theologian, I am part of this picture. We are part of this picture. Catholic colleges and universities are part of this picture. So that's why I think it's time to offer some considerations regarding the meaning of Gaudium Spes for Catholic theology, and indirectly, I think, for Catholic universities where theology is a fundamental, still today, part of the curriculum. Now, the key concept of tonight is that Gaudium Spes introduces in Catholic theology what has been called an hermeneutics of acknowledgement. So there is an acknowledgement of things that are out there. The interpretation of the relationship between modern culture and Christian anthropology is at the center of the divide between two tendencies that we can describe here ideal-typically. The neo-Augustinian tendency on one side and the neo-Thomist school on the other have been described recently in relation to the different anthropologies necessary for a correct hermeneutics of the authors of the Second Vatican Council. But to be simple, and to quote Australian theologian Ormond Rush, he says, the Augustinian school is wanting to set the church and the world in a situation of rivals. It sees the world in a negative light. Evil and sin so abound in the world that the church should be always suspicious and distrustful of it. Any openness to the world would be naive optimism, end quote. In Avery Dulles' description, the neo-Augustinian tendency views the church as far removed from a sinful world. Quote, the church as an island of grace in a world given over to sin. So this distinction of two ways of thinking the relationship church and world are both in Gaudium Spes. I think you cannot say that it is completely neo-Thomist, also because Gaudium Spes, as you know, is a very long text, but extremely long text. But there is a constitutional part, I would call it, that are the first few paragraphs. Here, paragraph 3 of Gaudium Spes manifests the Copernican revolution of Catholic ecclesiology of the relations between the church and the world, and I quote from the third paragraph, inspired by no earthly ambition, the church seeks but a solitary goal, to carry forward the work of Christ under the lead of the befriending Spirit. And Christ entered this world to give witness to the truth, to rescue and not to sit in judgment, to serve and not to be served. End quote. And what follows at number 4 is the best known passage of the beginning of Gaudium et Spes, with the famous expression, the signs of the times, that is one of the hermeneutical principles of the Second Vatican Council. And I quote, "To carry out such a task, the Church has always had the duty of scrutinizing the signs of the times and of interpreting them in light of the gospel. Today, the human race is involved in a new stage of history. Profound and rapid changes are spreading by degrees around the whole world." End quote. Now, this expression, signs of the times, is the key expression of Gaudium et Spes, and in a sense also of the Second Vatican Council. So here, signs of the times is not just about being aware of world events, but what it is a new semiotics of time, is the recognition that there are facts of history that a credible presentation of the faith cannot dismiss without losing its credibility. This is the real meaning of the qualification in the other sentence of the same 4th paragraph, and I quote, "In a language intelligible to each generation, the Church can respond to the perennial questions about this present life and the life to come, and about the relationship of the one to the other." So an intelligible language for a credible presentation of the faith in history. Now, speaking from the standpoint of the theological profession, Gaudium et Spes presents us with a challenge that is at the same time historical and theological. In other words, it puts the role of historical theologians especially at the center of the issue church vis-a-vis the world. And in this sense, the 5th paragraph is rescued from the apparent banality of its text, which tries to capture the nature of what modern world was in 1964-65, like a single frame in a developing action, but giving particular emphasis to the issue of knowledge, modern knowledge, science, technology, social sciences, history. And I quote here from the 5th paragraph. "Today's spiritual agitation and the changing conditions of life are part of a broader and deeper revolution. As a result of the latter, intellectual formation is ever increasingly based on the mathematical and natural sciences and on those dealing with man himself, while in the practical order, the technology which stems from these sciences takes on mounting importance. This scientific spirit has a new kind of impact on the cultural sphere and on modes of thought. Technology is now transforming the face of the earth and is already trying to master outer space. To a certain extent, the human intellect is also broadening its dominion over time, over the past by means of historical knowledge, over the future by the art of projecting and by planning. Advances in biology, psychology, and the social sciences not only bring men hope of improved self-knowledge, in conjunction with technical methods, they are helping humans exert direct influence on the life of social groups. End quote. So here it's clear that in Gaudium et Spes, Catholic theology is not discovering anything new. So history, society, change, they were there. But what Catholic theology was doing in Gaudium et Spes was acknowledging something that it knew all along existed, but that for a long time was cast as irrelevant or as an accident of history. Gaudium et Spes here recapitulates the rest of Vatican II. And just to mention the most important conciliar parallel document here, Gaudium et Spes, in the history of the Second Vatican Council, comes after Dei Verbum, the Constitution on Divine Revelation, that was approved before, but which had a much longer history of debate in the Second Vatican Council. And just like for the Verbum, Gaudium Spes takes history not as an accident, as something that shouldn't have happened. So the big issue that is openly cast anew here by the Council is about Christianity and time. Can Christianity be modern and up to date? Should Christianity be modern or up to date? Or should it be anti-modern? So what are the criteria to solve this issue? Now, the signs of the times are not just one more source for the formation of theologians. The theology of the signs of the times belongs to the issue of the modus procedendi of theology, of the method of doing theology. And here, Gaudium Spes does not offer ready-made solutions, but it offers a method for the church facing the future. And the consequences of this reorientation of theology on the cultural options for the church are immediate. It is the end of the rejection of the 19th century naturally anti-modernist option for the Catholic Church facing modernity. The Catholic long march toward modern culture was a long one, and until recently, before Vatican II, Catholics were not even supposed to have cultures in the plural. And after the shock of the revolutions of the 18th and 19th centuries, modernity was seen as the fruit of this separation of the world from the moral guidance of the only true church. And Catholics were allowed to entertain commerce with the modern world only de facto. So here, Gaudium Spes marks the beginning of a world church and puts to an end the rhetoric of the resentment against modernity and the modern world. And in this, there is a transition from a kind of utopian view to what a young German theologian commenting on Gaudium Spes called the heterotopia. So the church in Gaudium Spes doesn't become identified with the world, but it doesn't even go for the utopian option. It goes for the heterotopia, trying to create a different, another, but not a parallel space. And the shift here from disavowal and contempt to acknowledgement. And the key principle of the Second Vatican Council in general, and of Gaudium Spes in particular, is, in the words of Austrian Catholic ethicist Ingeborg Gabriel, the Hermeneutics of Acknowledgement, which is the product of a reflection on Paul Ricoeur's Parcours de la Reconnaissance, which is a book that was published. It's a collection of essays published in 2005. And this Austrian Catholic ethicist describes in this way this acknowledgement, and I quote, "The goal of this hermeneutic of acknowledgement is not the exclusion of others, but the inclusion as much as possible. Acknowledgement does not mean rejection in principle, nor uncritical acceptance. Acknowledgement means a positive setting yourself in a relation with the other. These others are the separated brothers and sisters of other churches, faithful of other religions, and other fellow men and women that, even if they are non-believers, hold on to fundamental human rights on the basis of an acknowledgement of one same human dignity." End quote. This acknowledgement is not just an extension of the requirement of tolerance, of being polite in a society that has become more diverse and more plural. It is a requirement of the gospel correctly understood. And I quote again here from Gabriel, "This acknowledgement builds the foundation of the unity of which the Church is sacrament and instrument. In this unity, the ethics of the gospel becomes real as an ethics marked by justice and love extended even to the love for the enemies. End quote. So if we take that the cultural turn operated by Gaudium and Spes is this acknowledgement, what are the specific acknowledgements that come from this turn for Catholic theology and for the Church? In my mind, there are a few that I'm trying to list here. The first one is that the hermeneutics of acknowledgement means for Catholic theology acknowledging the present cultural horizon as constitutive for theology and the magisterium of the Church, not only in terms of intelligibility, but most of all in terms of validity of the theological content. And I'm just making one example that is related to the relationship of theology with sciences. It's interesting to know that between the year 1633, when Galileo is condemned, and the official rehabilitation of Galileo by John Paul II in 1992, 360 years almost, the first quotation of Galileo is in a small, tiny footnote in Gaudium et Spes, which quotes not Galileo, but a book on Galileo. So the 60s were the years of space. And in the 60s, the Catholic Church was still reluctant to say something directly about Galileo. So here there is an issue not just of intelligibility, but of validity and credibility. Second, the hermeneutics of acknowledgement means accepting the fact that we live in an age of criticism and of critical approach to ideas. In this age of critical approach, the need emerges to lay new foundations for the moral and political, but also religious horizon of meaning in the context of the modern sense of history that is marked by autonomy and by the experience of rationality. That means for the theological and ecclesial context of a church in postmodernity, that being a church in the modern world is not just updating some techniques, but is accepting the idea that there are ruptures in the tradition and that there is a culture of the so-called communicative dissent in society, but also in the church. Third, the hermeneutic of acknowledgement means a new idea of culture that calls for the end of a walled-in Catholic subculture and the beginning of the end of the alternative that was typical of the medieval and early modern times, between either being a subculture that is typical of a minoritarian Catholicism or of the dominant culture that is typical of European Christendom. It's the beginning of a multicultural world, which means the end of a juxtaposition of cultures and the acknowledgement that the cultures talk one to the other. And even though Gaudium et Spes has been accused of being overly optimistic about modern culture, Gaudium et Spes is very realistic and sees clearly the ambivalence and the underside of modernity, as we can read in the same paragraph 4, and I quote, "Never has the human race enjoyed such an abundance of wealth, resources, and economic power, and yet a huge proportion of the world's citizens are still tormented by hunger and poverty, while countless numbers suffer from total illiteracy. Never before has man had so keen an understanding of freedom, yet at the same time new forms of social and psychological slavery make their appearance." End quote. All that said, we should recognize that Vatican II is open to a new understanding of culture, but is nevertheless less multicultural than we might expect. A certain Euro-Western canon is still very visible there. So for us now, it's not about accepting non-critically, acritically, a given multicultural paradigm. It is about understanding the Council's change of horizons, looking at the relationship between Catholic culture and culture as such. So the biggest shift here is not from pessimism to optimism, but from a canonical and preset idea of culture, one singular Catholic culture, to a more pluralistic and historical critical idea of cultures in the global church. And in this, there is a new and problematic appreciation of the relationship between culture and universality. And I quote again from Ingeborg Gabriel, although modernity aims at universality, it is in fact not universal but also particular. Just like for every culture, advantages and disadvantages of modernity in terms of the gospel are to be distinguished. In fact, today there is not a juxtaposition of cultures, but an entanglement, a penetration, and at best, a fertilization between different forms of culture, while globalizing modernity remains hegemonic, end quote. And this brings us to the fourth issue about Catholicism and globalization in terms of the global responsibility of the Church towards the world and humankind. The Hermeneutics of Acknowledgement means a new way of articulating the global universal claim of the Catholic Church in terms of humanization, as Gaudium Spes at number 11 says. Humanization is part of our journey to the kingdom. Gaudium Spes 40 talks about heavenly and earthly citizenship while talking about the church and the modern world in terms of mutua relatio, of dialogical relationship. And in the words of Hans-Joachim Sander, I quote, the representation of the salvation means not only a communication of God's grace, but also a pastoral act. It becomes real when we reinforce human dignity and we emphasize the meaning of everyday life for salvation. It is evidence of the supernatural nature of the church when the church contributes to the more humane life conditions for human beings. End quote. Fifth, the hermeneutics of acknowledgement means acknowledging that modernity is carried culturally on the shoulders of Christianity, or as Karl Rahner said, modernity is the runaway son of Christianity. This puts the church squarely in the world. The world is the place of the gospel. In a lecture delivered at a meeting of the Roman Catholic Lutheran World Federation in Sweden in 1968, a young German theologian called Walter Kasper used Gaudium Spes and Dei Verbum to articulate the relationship between the gospel and the world as a locus theologicus, as a theological criterion. And I quote here from Kasper 1968, we meet the gospel not only listening to scripture, tradition, and the magisterium, but also of necessity by listening to the world. Concrete human history is a constitutive part of revelation. We meet the gospel not only in the context of historical circumstances from which we could detach it. History is not the context, is the text itself. The gospel is not a doctrine without history, nor a universal dialective of existence, but it is connected to a concrete history that happened only once, This concrete world, which changes historically, is constitutively part of the event of the gospel. The world is a locus theologicus, that is a criterion to know if the gospel is adequately implemented. End quote. So what is the bigger, chain theologically that is behind this idea of acknowledgement? Ultimately, the reason for this hermeneutic of acknowledgement is the desire of the church to follow Jesus' example, leaving behind as much as possible other examples that do not correspond with Jesus. That is the meaning of the pastorality of the Second Vatican Council. Pastorality is the theological expression for the spiritual rediscovery of the concrete story of Jesus in the life of the church. And Vatican II and Gaudium Spes, especially, are the highest moment of pastoral theology as historical hermeneutics of the Christian truth. So, from the example set up by the life of Jesus, how do we go to the concrete life of the church? What are the consequences of these acknowledgments operated by Gaudium Spes? What does that mean for our cultural horizon, for the relationship between culture of criticism and dissent, the issue of subcultures and universality, and the urge for humanization in the world as the place of the gospel? So here there are a few points: what, who, where, and how. So the what for a learning church is a new understanding of the proper but not exclusive role that the Greek-Latin paradigm should play in a theology that seeks a truly universal Catholicity. And this not only because the appropriation of the Greek-Latin paradigm by the Catholic churches of the Western world is questionable, at least as an exclusive appropriation, but it is because of the shift described by Bernard Lonergan in his famous 1968 lecture, Thomism for Tomorrow. It's the shift from a classicist culture to a world marked by historical consciousness. And I quote here from Lonergan: they are changes not in God's self-disclosure or our faith, but in our culture. They are changes such as occurred when the first Christians moved from Palestine into the Roman Empire, when scholasticism yielded to humanism, the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Counter-Reformation. Ours is a new age, and enormous tasks lie ahead. But we shall be all the more likely to surmount them if we take the trouble to understand what is going forward and why. End quote. And here, Vatican II, I think, guides this shift mostly intellectually, and we have to be honest, it's a shift that I think happened intellectually. It didn't happen institutionally, and we know what that means. But here, I think that there are a few consequences at the intellectual level that I think are very relevant for us. So the first is that with Gaudium Spes, the church looks into history and present time to understand more deeply the gospel. That is, where the gospel is already, sometimes even without the church, and where the church can recognize it and be inspired by it. It's a church that can announce the gospel only in the language and the cultural context of today, and not be trapped by some kind of nostalgia. And here, it's one of the overarching themes of the Second Vatican Council that begins with the liturgical constitution already in 1962. Third, with Gaudium Spes, it's a church that believes in the ability of the gospel to sustain the encounter with the present times. And here, Pope John, in the opening speech, Gaudium Mater Ecclesia, said that the prophets of gloom, quote, behave as though at the time of former councils everything was a full triumph for the Christian idea and life and for proper religious liberty, end quote. Here, church history may not teach us what we would like it to teach us, but at least it reassures us about the mythical nature of past golden ages. Fourth, in Gaudium et Spes, the church needs, in many cases, the help of experts to understand the world of today. In other words, the church needs to acknowledge humbly its ignorance on some issues. Fifth, in Gaudium et Spes, the church accepts the fact that the whole people of God has the task, but especially church leaders and theologians have the task to listen before making a judgment on the signs of the times. And fifth, the church in Gaudium et Spes offers a clearly liberationist perspective. It's a church that wants to liberate humans from every form of slavery and oppression. So all this, I think, it's timely because it has clear implication for what we mean by Catholic culture, by Catholic education, teaching in a Catholic environment, and for every learning Catholic, but especially in this kind of setting. So in this theology that puts at the center the signs of the times, in this modern culture of the Vatican II, the liberal arts have a central place. The ability to make a judgment on the signs of the times requires a cultural awareness that is exactly the opposite of utilitarianism. The care for the common good requires core knowledge. The Council praised conscience as, I quote from Gaudium et Spes 16, the conscience as the secret core and the sanctuary of the human person, Gaudium et Spes 16. And this value put on conscience requires a care for the cultural formation of conscience. The humanization ethics of the Church of Vatican II requires for its leaders a certain measure of humanistic culture that is different from modern secular humanism. And here it's interesting to know that in the corpus of the Second Vatican Council, humanism appears only 3 times, but the word human, humanus, appears over 200 times. So that is a first step. The what? Who does that in the Catholic Church? The Hermeneutics of Acknowledgement means the acknowledgement of new subjects and of their voices, of women, of young people, of the poor, and of a pluralistic understanding of cultures in a pluralistic world. Their voices are to be acknowledged as voices in the modern world out there, and also as voices in the church of today, which is something that is more evident, I think, in post-Vatican II theology much more than in Gaudium et Spes itself. But Gaudium et Spes is addressed to all men and women of goodwill, and that sets a new stage for a church that teaches but also learns. So how is this church learning? As a church that cherishes the poor and its own poverty has humility, the church envisioned by Gaudium et Spes operates in a world of knowledge with a few notes that I humbly propose here. With sobriety, which means not addicted to spiritual or cultural enhancers. With austerity, which means with discipline and aware of its limits. With simplicity, which means accessible. With a certain agility of the mind. with what I would call an intellectual chastity, which means being able to distinguish what are the safe relationships from the unsafe relationships, and also a certain degree of magnanimity and generosity, which means willing to serve, to teach, and to learn without compensation or recognition. Where is this church learning? The Hermeneutics of Acknowledgement means for the where of a learning church, going, as Pope Francis says, to the peripheries, especially as he said in the exhortation Evangelii Gaudium. So here there is a larger picture, as we know, about modernity, but the ambivalence of modernity cannot replace, I think, the fundamental solidarity of the church with humankind and its history. Now, to conclude, I would like to conclude with one question that is on the value of the legacy of Gaudium et Spes, or is Vatican II still worth considering? Recently, a dear friend, Jesuit historian Stephen Schlusser of Loyola Chicago, wrote an essay titled Dancing on the Edge of the Volcano, Biopolitics and What Happened After Vatican II. It's a very, very fine essay, and he assesses critically the legacy of Vatican II in light of the tumultuous post-conciliar period, and especially in light of the advent of the life issues and more generally what he calls of biopolitics. So the issues of gender, of sexuality, eugenics, marriage, family, celibacy, race, new weapons, new warfare. And in the conclusions, Schlusser writes what follows, and I'm quoting. The years 1962-65 stand as a fulcrum. When we look at December 1965 from the political vantage point, the Council appears to have concluded an armistice with modernity. However, looking at the same moment from the biopolitical perspective, the Council seems to have been caught off guard, struggling to keep up with rapid currents outstripping its capacity to make sense. One way of historically interpreting this seeming paradox is that biopolitical issues in 1965 had taken over the recently vacated space once occupied by 18th and 19th century political issues, even as the Council euphorically celebrated its peace with the past, it unknowingly danced on the edge of a volcano. End quote. Now, the world of 2015 is indubitably different from the world of 1965. But the difference in what we mean by modern world between 65 and 2015, I think that is my response to Steve, would undermine Vatican II only if we take Vatican II as a paradigm, as a set framework of responses, of ideas, and not, as I think we should take Vatican II, as a paradigmatic event, as something that changed not theological propositions, but changed the method of doing theology. The most important commentator of Vatican II in this last decade, German dogmatician of Tübingen, Peter Hunermann, he published recently an essay in German titled What Did Vatican II Say? That echoes Karl Rahner's question in his famous lecture delivered in Rome in December 1965, right at the end of the Council. And in this essay, Hunermann offers a summary of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council as a fundamental reorientation of Catholic theology. And in particular, he says of the teaching of Vatican II in light of the changes in the position of the Church in the modern world, what follows, and I quote, "The statements of the Second Vatican Council derive their plausibility from this new situation. They become responsible affirmations. This is because even faith statements must be based on their credibility. This is the ratio fide, a responsible and thus reasonable belief. In this moment in time in our culture, the legacy of Gaudium et Spes, I think, represents a very delicate inheritance, and not just for the survival of the legacy of Vatican II, but I think for the very survival of a Catholicism able to interact with modern and postmodern social and intellectual imaginary. And again, I think this is a particularly delicate inheritance for the Catholic Church and Catholic higher education in America. Here, common good, so ideas like common good, universal common good, are extremely difficult or impossible cases, I think, to make without an ecclesial and magisterial reception of Gaudium et Spes. The crisis of the idea of common good, I think, is in some Catholic quarters the product of a cynicism against Vatican II and of the dismissal of Gaudium et Spes in particular. So this is not a partisan issue. So this is not a liberal versus conservative issue. This is a general issue, I think, because without the universal cosmological worldview of the pastoral constitution, modernity becomes easily the triumph of identitarian narratives. And in the words of the most important Italian theologian today, Pierangelo Sequeri, I quote, "The anthropological narrative in today's mass narcissism does not create democracy out of differences, but rather out of obsessive micro-conflict of identity." End quote. There is, I think, a central theological political element in the culture of Gaudium et Spes that has vast consequences for the Church and for the idea of Catholic education today. Vatican II, and Gaudium et Spes especially, receives and accepts elements from a modern, cosmopolitan, secular culture, and derive both from the Christian tradition and from a secular modernity that Christianity itself helped create by engendering the idea of an international, cosmological, almost legal order and the ethics of global solidarity. In the light of the signs of our times, today at the beginning of the 21st century, I think Gaudium et Spes has lost nothing of its relevance. The moral and political universal perspectives of Vatican II come from a creative process of interpretation that is not closed and finished. And this is why we are here at this conference. Thank you very much. Well, I think it looks like what we have. So I think that whenever we try to build a Catholic culture that is totally separated, it is a fictional exercise. And that might be good if we are aware of that. But sometimes we think that we really manage to do that. So, and I don't think that we should dilute our Catholic culture or any culture in a big blob of cultures. But I think that, in a sense, every Catholic in the world is a Vatican II Catholic. So that is true for some theological ideas or some practices. If you read the Bible, you are a Vatican II Catholic. If you don't believe that Protestants are going to hell, you are a Vatican II Catholic. I mean, all these things. But especially for culture, so here I think that we tend to be blind to the reality that cultures have always communicated. And to be very, honest, so what we have seen, recently, these impulses to go back to Latin liturgy. In Latin, I see them as attempts to recreate a past that never existed. And so, in this sense, I think that it is theologically dangerous, because our call as Christians is to transform the world that there is, and not to recreate a world that makes us feel safe, comfortable. So that's it. It would require a very long answer, but I think that was long enough. So. Yeah, so here Gaudium et Spes is treated sometimes like a child that nobody wants. So Americans sometimes say, well, in the 60s we were already in postmodernity, while Gaudium et Spes is just modern. So here it's, I think that, for example, if we have Pope Francis now, it's because of the reception of Gaudium et Spes in Latin America. You cannot, understand Vatican II without Gaudium et Spes and without Latin America, especially. So the emergence of a certain new awareness of the so-called new churches, out of North America or out of Europe, in Africa, Asia, it has a sometimes hidden but unmistakable basis in Gaudium et Spes. Every social teaching of the church on a fair or just economy, on the environment, is based there. So here, the temptation sometimes is to see Vatican II only where Vatican II is mentioned. And we have to do that, because as theologians, we have to say things out loud. But as I said in the previous question, the Catholic Church today is a Vatican II church much more than it acknowledges. And that's fine. So in this, I see the example of Pope Francis, who I think he's doing Vatican II without ever mentioning Vatican II, which is what he should do. I'm very happy with that. So I don't need to hear Vatican II to get what's happening. And so my experience, I'm not an expert of Asia, but I taught 2 years ago for 2 weeks in Indonesia, and last summer for 1 week in China. I saw, what was interesting for me is that they take Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes, as the very condition of existence of those churches. It happened for the the first time in my life that at one of my faculty lectures, 3 bishops showed up, and they took questions, they took notes. And so my experience is that out of the European, North American context, Vatican II is not perceived as threatening, which is exactly the impression that you have sometimes in a few places, especially when they're talking about the Vatican II is taken, I mean, by some as bad manners. Why? Because Vatican II has been the object of a series of accusations that are socio-political but not theological. So it's very difficult to make a serious theological case against Vatican II. It's much easier for Europeans and North Americans to say, well, Vatican II was the beginning of the social moral code of these things, which was happening already before. So social history tells us that secularization was happening in the 30s already. And so here Vatican II is there even when we don't see that. And I'm fine with that as long as the council doesn't become the object of an intentional removal. That's different. Of its message, of its content, which is something that I have seen, that we have seen sometimes. And so there's a fine line there between, implementing a certain theology that is based in the most important teaching of the Catholic Church in the last 4 centuries, or doing something that goes against that because you think Vatican II was the beginning of the end. And we have seen that in some cases.
I have a theory that the council brought down the Soviet Union.
Let me hear that. Sorry?
It allowed the church to select the Pope who was not Italian, Polish.
Absolutely, you're right.
He made the connection with Solidarity and Lech Walesa, which started the crumbling of the wall and the Union. I haven't heard anybody else say that. Would you think that's true or not?
Well, so there is an historical fact. So the only reason a cardinal from Poland could get the permission to go to the conclave twice in 2 months was the so-called Ostpolitik, the diplomatic opening of the Vatican towards Eastern Europe that happens with John the 23rd, and 62-63 is the beginning of that. So indirectly, that is so. As an historian, I think there are many other factors, but the Second Vatican Council understood that you could deal with communism in a certain way, and not just by way of excommunication. That was the intuition of Pope John, who was a diplomat, but he was also a pastor. So there's a case to be made there. Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I'm struck by the idea that, as you say, our topic, maybe most properly, is culture. But as we think about defending and protecting and asserting and playing out for the world around us a Catholic culture, I'm struck by something else that you talk about. You sort of call our attention to the existence of this matter of identity and difference and these other hallmarks that remind us that, in fact, at least as far as intellectual culture is concerned, modernity was over before the church addressed itself to the modern world. And so I worry, and I wonder whether you would talk a little bit for us, that to the one side there is the danger of catching up to address the modern world, but to the other side there is the Charybdis that matches the Scylla, that we become just another identity competing in the conflict of identities with everybody else in a cacophony where everyone is marking out their territory, we for ourselves, they for themselves, and we lose the ability to evangelize. Should we worry it's too late?
I try very hard never to use the word identity. It's something that I think it's dangerous because, especially if you talk about Catholic identity, because it tends to be built in opposition to something else, or out of fear, or out of distinction. So here, one of the reasons for the success, I think, and of the fascination of the Second Vatican Council, that at the Council, Catholicism, it doesn't understand itself as one part against or facing. It understands itself in a cosmological way. So we have our structures, our rituals, the sacraments, and that builds something that I don't like the word, but builds an identity. But Vatican II says the church is here not as a union for the benefit of the members, but it is something that covers the whole world, and at a certain point, the cosmos. It's something, and here Teilhard, all this. So it is the idea of the church not as fighting for itself, and not even for its cultural survival. It's something. So what Gaudium Spes says about the poverty of the church is not poverty of means. It's poverty of its cultural structures that at some point Vatican II said, well, we had built these centuries of structures, but our Catholics, they never read the gospel. That's a problem. Okay, so here culture is used, I think, by Vatican II more to re-understand what's outside, but not to understand itself as a culture. I don't think that Catholicism is a culture. It has a culture, it has cultures, but I would take as a radical diminishing of what Catholicism is to describe it as a culture. I think it's dangerous, and it's unfaithful to what the Catholic Church is. So here you're right. In these last 50 years, what we mean by culture, by multiculturalism, is very, very different. So here I would not go back to a certain paragraph that tells you what, but it's the idea that the Catholic Church is not something that you build by separation, by enmity, by lack of friendship, by fear. It works in a different way. So there are many ways to describe what Vatican II does, but as I always say, one description that is safely correct is that the Vatican II, the church tries to look more like Jesus and less like Charlemagne or Constantine or whoever. So I think that is still very valid. That's still there, I think.
Massimo, thank you for this wonderful and rich lecture that leaves us all with a lot to ponder. I'd like to press just a little bit the previous question in the following way. The claim that the hermeneutics of acknowledgement amounts to the statement that the horizon of intelligibility is set by culture for theology strikes me as sort of liberal Protestantism light. Light here means fundamentally that you don't have the kind of typical epistemology of religious experience that comes with that claim. And I have just two quick sets of tensions arising out of that. One is that if the document is the baby of Chenu, or if Chenu had such a tremendous role in the document, then the whole point, right, of a ressourcement figure is to say that in fact the horizon of intelligibility is far greater than the contemporary culture. So that's one set of tensions. The second one has to do with your claim, which I think is absolutely accurate, is that you don't really have one culture. What you have is a plurality of culture. And that's not quite acknowledged by the council because the council is a modernist enterprise. But if I have a plurality of cultures, then I will never, ever have anything amounting to a unity of theology if, in fact, the horizon of intelligibility is set by culture. So I will always have only theologies plural. And anything that undergirds this enterprise and secures its unity is at a risk of being lost. I'm not saying that it's impossible to secure unity, but I think it amounts to almost at the risk of being lost.
Okay, so the first question about Chenu's role, it's interesting. So Chenu is one of the most important thinkers for his idea leading to Vatican II. Is one of those theologians who was left out of the commissions of the council. The only bishop who would take him as a peritus was a bishop of Madagascar. So that tells you a lot about. So he had been, condemned by the Holy Office in the 30s already. So he's not part of that commission. But when you read the Joys and Hopes, Signs of Time, it is Chenu. He's left out in the last year when there's also this split between Germans who are not happy with this text and French who are the major drafter of this text. So here, that document has a very complex history. It is the French, but ultimately not Chenu really. Your second question is this. I think that the solution here, and again, I see that quite clearly in what Pope Francis is doing, is that there is a compatibility between a plurality of theologies and a unity of belief and of magisterium. So one thing that happened to me during the pontificate of Pope Benedict, one of the interesting things is that as an academic theologian become Pope, the magisterium of the church and theology, they became one in the perception. And that was dangerous. It was one of the unanticipated consequences of electing a professional theologian to the papacy. And so Pope Francis has no PhD, which I think is great for a Pope. So here, I think it's very safe to maintain the distinction between the magisterium, the teaching of the church, and what the church does beyond teaching. Because let's be honest, so the church now is credible or is accepted not essentially because of what it teaches, but because of what it does. And the plurality of theologies, I think it is compatible with that. So, but you're right. So we are just the first day in this, because when you have, for example, issues of Christology, Christology in Asia is a completely different grammar, in intellectual grammar. But I don't think that, so you say theology must be intelligible with culture, but plurality of culture makes it impossible. I don't think that. I think that in a sense, the experience of plurality has always been there. In a sense, we have lived in the centuries before Vatican II in the idea that we had always been papalist. We had always been the church of the First Vatican Council. Very Romanized. If we look at the Eastern Catholic churches, the plurality has always been there much more than I think we acknowledge. That's my answer as a historian. I'm not a philosopher like you, so I tend to see things more historically than conceptually. Okay, what we know of the impact of Gaudium et Spes after Vatican II, we had a Catholic Church that on doctrinal matters has remained remarkably united. I don't see, and so we have issues of other kind, but not a rediscussion of the central tenets of the Christian faith. There's no discussion on the sacraments of the profession of faith. I think in the first 50 years after Vatican II, that says something, I think, of the solidity of that. Okay, yeah. So he says the change that takes place in the 20th century, he says, is not just modernity for technology, or it's this transition from an understanding of things that is essentialist. And so things are this way, and they have always been like that, and they will never change, to an historical understanding of things. And so that's true for institutions, ideas, even values. And so he says this is what's typical of our cultural horizon, that now we tend to see things in their development. And we tend to see ourselves, the church, theology, as part of this development. So that is the transition that makes the work of theology much more part of an historical understanding of things. And so, and less philosophical, or if you want, is the transition from a metaphysical understanding of theology to a more history of salvation understanding of theology. So Lonergan, that was his way of explaining in that famous lecture of 68. So 68 happened many things, but also for theology that was an important year. And he interpreted that in light not only of what Vatican II did, but of the historical changes in historicism in the 19th century, early 20th century. So it's a change that happens in a couple of centuries, not in a couple of years. It's a long-term change. Thank you.
Yes, Mike Tegeter, I'm a priest here in the Archdiocese. We have the three of us just got back from Nicaragua, and I've been there before. And I think one of the successes of Vatican II is the fact that you're so comfortable with fellow Catholics, going to church with different communities there, and you're right at home. You celebrate the same way with kind of a spirit of uplift. But the big difference, and maybe it's a hermeneutic, I'm not sure, but it's an approachability on the part of the bishops there. We met the bishop down in Bluefields, so approachable, so humble, so gracious, hospitable, just like right out of what Paul says in his letter to Timothy about what a bishop should be. But that was refreshing.
I just add one quick thing. So one of the most fascinating episodes in the history of the council and of those weeks of Gaudium et Spes is this famous meeting in the catacombs of Rome. So when a few dozens of bishops, especially Latin American, they met and they celebrated Mass and they took a pledge for a poor church of the poor. It's one of the most forgotten episodes. And so, in a sense, Latin American bishops expected more from Gaudium et Spes, but Gaudium et Spes is the document that is the closest to them, probably. And in this sense, it is clear that Gaudium et Spes has been received in different ways in different parts of the world. That is still part of a history of the post-council period that will need to be written at some point. I don't know when, but we need a global history of the post-council period, which we don't have right now. And so that is intellectually, if there are young students here who are interested in a groundbreaking project for the next decade or so, that is it would be really crucial, not just for what we know of history, but also for our theology, I think. Thank you very much.